The quality of a great story can often be traced to time spent investing in developing a really good idea behind that story to begin with. In this video, I'm going to focus on that stage of the storytelling process, how to generate strong ideas at the start, and what that's got to do with professionalism and audiences. I'm also going to touch on how to get credit for the time that you spend working on ideas and considering things like audience and professionalism. Let's start with those ideas then. We often talk about coming up with ideas or generating ideas. Actually, it's really important to think of it more as developing ideas, starting with the seed of an idea and working on that. And I want to begin by asking you right at the start to pause in a minute and see how you come up with ideas for any one of the following. Choose whichever one is most relevant to your particular professional context, which industry you're working in or you want to work in. So you can generate ideas for a radio package, and that's a story of about 1 to 3 minutes that's going to be played as part of a radio show. If you're working in PR, you can come up with an idea for a blog post for a campaign for a women's health charity. If documentary is your field, then come up with ideas for a 10-minute YouTube documentary. And if data journalism is your field, come up with ideas for a data-driven news story. So just pause the video and just start coming up with ideas until you've got 3 of those ideas. Once you've got 3 ideas, unpause the video and come back to the rest of this video. Okay. So hopefully you should now have 3 ideas, and the reason that I asked you to do that is it's really important to identify what kind of techniques you use to come up with ideas when you're starting from scratch. And there are 4 particular mistakes that I want to highlight and get you to look out for. The first common mistake that people make is to come up with ideas of processes rather than stories. So it's quite common for people to say, I'm going to interview this person, or I'm going to scrape some data on this particular topic, or I'm just going to do a story about this subject. Now, those aren't stories, those are processes. And you get this in the industry all the time as well. You'll hear people talking to each other saying, oh, I'm going to interview this person for a story. When that happens in the industry, often what the person is really saying is that they have a good idea, hopefully, what story they're going to tell about that person, but they're still not very good at communicating that to someone else. So the first thing to highlight is try not to talk about process, try to think about what the story is that you're going to get as a result of that process, or why you're going through that process. What are you expecting to have at the end of that? As an example of just how common this particular mistake is, there's a data journalism awards that I follow every year, and one of the judges made a comment about the last set of awards, saying that they actually throw out the vast majority of submissions because, as she puts it, they are great data exercises but not great journalism. So in other words, in data journalism in particular, I think we often get attracted by some interesting processes, whether it might be scraping or sentiment analysis, or something really interesting technically, but actually it's not a great story. So try to watch out for that in your own idea generation. A second mistake that people make very often is they talk about a subject that they're going to tell a story about. So you might say, I'm going to do a story about global warming, or I'm going to do a story about mental health. Now, that's getting you closer to the story, but it still isn't a story. There's nothing happening there. So again, try and move beyond the subject and think, well, what is it about that subject that you're going to tell? And I'll come on to some techniques for doing that in a moment. The third mistake is to describe an objective. So you might talk about what you want to do through the story that you're going to tell. So I want to showcase local musicians, for example. Well, that helps you identify which stories might be the best ones to tell, but again, you still need to identify what stories you can tell that are going to showcase local musicians, for example. And a fourth mistake is to actually skip the idea generation stage, or at least you fail to complete it, and you start talking about obstacles before you've even finished coming up with the ideas. So you might start by saying, well, I'd like to speak to this particular sports person, but I don't think they'll agree to an interview. Or I'd like to do a story about this major issue, but I'm not sure if there's data about it. So that word but appears in the middle of your idea generation process. This is really getting in the way of your idea generation. And a good way to tackle this and many of the other common mistakes is to think about idea development as a development process with a number of different stages. The idea generation stage is just the first part of that. Filtering your ideas based on things like practicality or whether they're good ideas or not, that should come second. That should be a separate stage. So if you find yourself coming up with obstacles, or you find yourself immediately leaping to one particular idea thinking that's the best and you're not going to generate any more, then slow yourself down and remember that the objective of the idea generation stage is to just generate as many ideas as possible. There's no concern about quality. It's really about trying to get past the obvious ideas, trying to get past any obstacles in your thinking, and just coming up with lots of ideas. Then once you've got those ideas, you can start to move to filtering and kind of judging your ideas and editing your ideas and actually doing the research to develop them further. And we'll come on to those stages as we go along. Now, I mentioned about some of the mistakes that people often make around choosing topics or choosing processes. A key technique to tackle that is to add a verb to the topic that you're interested in. So if you said, I'm going to do a story about graffiti, well, what's happening around graffiti? What activities, what actions can you tell a story about? So it could be that you tell a story about what authorities are doing about graffiti. You could tell a story about how one artist or multiple artists become successful. Or indeed the opposite, how they have some sort of negative experience, so they get arrested or they experience failure. You can talk about art collectors of graffiti and what they do. So just think about verbs around the topic. Once you've got those sorts of questions, so what happens to the artists, how did graffiti become mainstream, what do the authorities do, you can very simply turn those questions into statements. So the question, what are authorities doing to reduce graffiti, becomes a story about what authorities are doing to reduce graffiti. The question, how did graffiti go from the streets to the art gallery, becomes a story about how it went from the streets to the art gallery. So you can turn that question very easily by just changing the tense a little bit from a question to a statement, and that statement becomes, I'm going to tell a story about how this thing is happening, or what someone is doing, or what happened to some person. So at this point, I'd like you to pause the video again and take the ideas that you generated and start to apply some of the techniques that I've just detailed. If you find that you're focusing on subjects, try and add those verbs. If you're stopping at the best idea, or you're putting obstacles in front of yourself, then just focus on the quantity of ideas that you're generating. Don't worry about quality. We're going to come on to quality later. But in any idea generation process, it's really key to spend a decent amount of time on idea generation, because too often people just settle for the first idea and it's often not a very good one. So pause the video, generate at least 3 more ideas, and then resume the video then. Right, I'm going to take a detour now into professionalism, and this has a lot to do with the second stage of idea development, which is filtering your ideas. And I want to ask you a question. I want you to think about what you think makes a story professional. This idea of professionalism is a really interesting one in our current age, because 20, 30, 40 years ago, it was very easy to make a distinction between professional storytelling and amateur storytelling. Professional storytelling was published. That was the definition of most professional storytelling. It was on TV, it was on the radio, it was in the newspapers, the magazines. And if people were amateur storytellers, then they weren't paid, it was not published. But now, of course, lots of amateur, in fact, most amateur storytelling is published as well. So it becomes harder to make that distinction between professionalism and amateurism. The question I want to ask you, and again, just pause this video and write down what you think distinguishes an amateur podcast and a professional podcast. An amateur piece of video storytelling and a professional piece of video storytelling, a piece of professional journalism versus amateur journalism, or someone doing it as a hobby. So again, pause the video, write down some thoughts, and then I'm going to tell you what I think. Okay, so what do I think? Well, and these are just my thoughts. It'll be interesting to compare these to yours and where they overlap. I think a really obvious one is audience. As amateurs, we often tell stories for our own pleasure. That's our payment. We're not getting paid as a professional, and that's obviously a key ingredient as well. So we're going to go with money. But when we're not being paid for something, we're doing it for our own pleasure, or perhaps for our own development, to challenge us technically, to perhaps eventually get a job doing it professionally. But when you're doing it professionally, you're doing it for an audience, and that means that you might be telling stories that you yourself are not interested in, or you weren't interested in before you started telling them. You might tell them in a different way, which is more relevant to your audience than to yourself. So that difference between serving yourself and serving an audience, I think that's one of the most important ingredients of professionalism. Now, money and funding are another key element. So we're thinking about, someone being paid, you being paid to produce this material. And that means that there's probably some funding model involved. It might be that you are your stories help to sell subscriptions, or they might sell merchandise, or there might be events that are related, that are created around the communities that your stories and other people's stories create. But generally there needs to be some consideration of money. It might be that you're paid to pass on a particular message, if it's a PR context. So that's a key element of professionalism. Now, related to that, we've got codes and conventions. In fact, let's just call that conventions. It needs to be conventional. It needs to follow the conventions of the medium, the conventions of the types of stories that you're telling. So we often are able to distinguish between stuff that is professional because it's well produced. It makes sense. Amateur material doesn't quite follow the conventions that we would expect, or it's not breaking them in an effective enough way to be professional as well. So one of the reasons we have conventions is again money, an audience. We need conventions because it makes media production efficient. So everyone in a team understands how something is produced. It also makes it easy for the audience to understand the story that we're telling. And audiences come with all sorts of expectations. Okay, this is a news story. It's going to follow certain conventions. It's going to be objective. It's going to tell me the facts. If we violate those conventions, then the audience is at best confused and at worst really annoyed and frustrated. So conventions are a really key marker of professionalism as well. Doesn't mean it's unoriginal. It doesn't mean it's boring. In fact, quite the opposite, rather. One of the conventions is maintaining audience interest by through various techniques, but conventions are more about helping an audience to understand what to expect and to stay interested. I think a final quality I would say of professionalism is originality, and this is probably the least significant of the four, because there is a lot of professional content which is unoriginal in the sense that there's no new information. But I do think that particularly when you're trying to get into the media industry, originality of material is really key in setting your material apart from others and establishing your skills as a professional storyteller. What I mean by originality, well, there's a couple of aspects to this. Original information is really key. So you've done an interview to get original information, or you've done some original analysis of data, or you've found some documents that no one else has. Or it's some original treatment. That's the other approach as well. It's an original perspective. And that's where the information might not be original, but you've approached it in a way which brings it to life. So originality is a really key quality of professionalism as well. Professional storytelling is about telling your audience something new, or telling your audience something in a new way. Now let's focus on audience as the most important of those elements. What are we talking about when we identify an audience? We often talk about some sort of demographics, how old this audience is, where they live and work, what sorts of class they are, what level of education they might have. A couple of mistakes that people often make are being too specific or being too general. So sometimes people say, well, my story is for everyone, or this documentary is for everyone. If you say that, you're probably lying to yourself as well as to everyone else, because at the very least it will be limited to people who speak the language of the documentary. But also, a story is very rarely told for everyone. It's you're always going to be assuming certain knowledge on the part of your audience. You're going to be assuming a certain cultural background for them to be able to understand the story that you're telling. So it's very rarely everyone, and in fact it should not be everyone, because you have to think about what knowledge you can take for granted in your audience and what knowledge they will not probably have. So being too general is one mistake. The other mistake is being too specific. So sometimes people will say, well, my story is about teachers, so my audience is teachers. But obviously that's not the case. If you're telling a story about teachers, well, obviously anyone interested in education, anyone with kids in school, or anyone who's at school, all of those people are going to be interested in that story. And if it's a really, really good story, then actually it might be a wider audience as well. If it's not just about education, but it's about kind of how people overcome adversity, then that might have a wider audience. So try to think somewhere in the middle, who will be interested in this story more broadly, but also what particular education level do they have, what knowledge are they bringing, what aspect of this story might they be more interested in than others. Think about where they consume stories and how they consume stories, because that will affect where you tell it and how you tell it. Think about why they're being targeted. So it might be that you're looking to build a community. There might be other objectives. And think about, related to that, their needs, their reasons for reading the story. And when we talk about audience needs, this is a useful framework to refer to. Most stories satisfy an audience's need for knowledge, an audience's need for understanding, their need for feeling, or their need to do something. So there's a difference between stories which are just entertaining, they're about diverting an audience or inspiring an audience, And then there are stories which are much more practical. You know, here's how to do something. Here's some practical information. This is what an expert says you should do. That's a much more practical story in terms of your audience's needs. Lots of news is focused on an audience's need for knowledge. So what's going on, keep me updated, keep me informed. And lots of feature articles and documentaries and podcasts are about more understanding. So, okay, there's something already in the news that I already know about, but I want to hear some different perspectives on this, or I want to go into a bit more depth. That's a different need again. If you have a clear idea of which need your story is going to address, then that makes it much easier for you to get the information that you need to tell that story, and also ask the right questions in interviews and other gathering of information for that story. Now, in terms of your objectives, I mentioned building a community. In journalism, another objective would be selling subscriptions, for example. In podcasts, it might be about, you might have merchandise or an advertising model. In PR, it might be about changing behavior or raising awareness, delivering a certain message. Having that in mind is useful as well, because really what you're looking to do is find a story that meets both your objectives and your audience's objectives as well, their information needs as well. In terms of the assignment for this module, these are things that you should be trying to evidence. You should be recording your process of identifying objectives and user needs, identifying the audience, and keep a record of that and include that in your assignment, and talk about the literature that you read that informed that process. So the model that I just showed around audience user needs is from a piece by Fletcher in 2024. You can reference that in your evaluation. You can say, you know, I identified a particular need, and that need comes from literature. So if I go back to this slide, you can see the reference in the upper right corner. You can click on that to read it in full, and you can relate what you're doing to that literature, because essentially here you are drawing on wider literature and research. Now, professionalism can also be shown in the way that you develop your idea. One of the markers of professionalism is that you need to be producing regular material, and that means you need a regular source of good story ideas. So it's not a case of just having one idea every few months. You know, if you're producing a podcast, you need multiple ideas every episode. If you're a journalist, you need multiple ideas for stories every day. So how do professional media workers get a regular source of good story ideas? That's a good question to try to research and read around, and speak to media workers as well. Ask them where they get their ideas from. Now, again, remember that idea development is not just about generating ideas, but choosing, filtering from the ideas that have been generated. So again, those are good questions to ask and research. Here are a number of techniques to get started with. These are professional techniques that you can find out about if you research idea generation, idea development in the media and more widely. You're probably familiar with mind mapping, for example. If you read a bit around this, you'll find different specific techniques that are used within the media industry. There's a creativity technique called Scamper that you may come across. I'll talk more about that later. There's the 5 whys technique, where you ask why 5 times, and you can find out more about that at that link. Free writing is where you just keep writing for a period of time to just loosen up your thinking, writing about a subject, and again, you can find out more at that link. There's the iceberg model and systems thinking, and there's generative AI. I'm going to do another video about how to use generative AI effectively for idea generation, and where it works best is by combining it with some of these other professional techniques that are listed above. But probably the most common thing that you'll be told by media workers in terms of how they come up with ideas is putting themselves in positions where they are regularly exposed to sources of inspiration, and ideally diverse sources of inspiration. For example, following the news is a very common behaviour in professional media workers, and that's right across documentary makers, podcast producers, obviously journalists themselves, public relations workers. The news is a regular source of inspiration, and also will often give you what's called a topical hook. So that's a reason for people to kind of read your story right now. Another common source of inspiration is to create some sort of diary or calendar that lists forthcoming events, including anniversaries. Again, that allows you to plan ahead for topical hooks, but also it gives you different angles, different potential stories to talk about. A third common way of finding inspiration is to just read lots of media in your field. So if you're doing journalism, you read lots of stories, and that gives you models to emulate. So you can take what someone else has done and kind of adapt it a little bit for yourself. So you might bring it up to date, you might localize it in your particular area or country. Likewise, documentaries, podcasts, PR campaigns, you will look at models of other media production and adapt that for your own particular circumstances. One other source of inspiration that's worth mentioning is just generally reading books, listening to podcasts, watching documentaries, reading reports as well. So, official reports, scientific reports, just reading widely. The more widely you read, you can be exposed to more diverse stuff, and it's more likely you'll come up with more original ideas. Likewise, attending conferences, reading research, that can expose you to different ideas that might not be as obvious as some of those identified in the top 3 bullets there. Just going around speaking to people, being curious, really helps you get inspired or gives you much more opportunity to come up with ideas. So let's now return to our ideas, and having established the importance of professionalism and objectives and audiences, we can start to use some of those to filter your long list of ideas. And it's worth identifying before you do that, what are your criteria actually for the right idea? Are you interested in originality? Are you interested in practicality? Are you interested in something that's relevant to that audience that you've identified? Probably all 3 are going to play a role in helping you identify what is a good idea and separating that from some of the less strong ideas. It's important to emphasize that actually this isn't just a process of accepting an idea and rejecting other ideas. It's actually a process of adapting and developing your ideas. So again, idea development more than idea generation. So there might be some ideas which you can make relevant through adapting. You can make it more topical, you can make it more original, you can make it more practical. All of those are possible. Don't reject ideas just because they might not be immediately obviously original or practical or relevant. You can still get something from that. So that's what I'd like you to do now. Again, pause the video, spend 5 minutes, set a timer to make sure you do actually spend at least 5 minutes, and spend that time just filtering the ideas that you've got, and start by identifying what those criteria are. Choose just one idea which you think most meets those criteria. Once you've done that, return to this video and we'll move on to editing. Okay, Now we're on to editing then. And I said earlier that I was going to explain a little bit more about what Scamper is. Scamper is a model for creative thinking, which is an acronym. It stands for 7 different ways of kind of stimulating your creative thinking around an idea. So these are different ways of basically editing and adapting your idea to make it potentially better. And they stand for substitute, combine, adapt, modify, put to another use, eliminate, or reverse. Now, this model is for general kind of creativity. It's not specific to media production. It's often used in relation to product development, for example. So some of these may be more useful than others. If we apply Scamper to our idea about what are authorities doing to reduce graffiti, these are some of the different ideas we can get through just modifying and adapting that base idea. So we can substitute one of the elements here. We can substitute authorities. We can say, what are business owners doing to reduce graffiti? We could substitute graffiti as well. We could say, what are authorities doing to reduce littering, for example? So substituting is a common technique for adapting your idea. We can combine different ideas. So we could say, okay, what are authorities doing, but also, is it working? So we've taken 2 different ideas and combined them. We can adapt what we've done, so we can change it from what are authorities doing to why aren't they doing more. We could modify it by extending it from one country to a number, or we could look at different areas of a country. Putting to another use, an example of that would be, well, we were planning to do this as a text story, for example, but actually we're going to do it as an Instagram carousel or a TikTok video or a podcast. We can eliminate part of a story as well. So when we talk about authorities, well, authorities would take in a number of different organisations. We could eliminate all of those apart from just the police, so we could narrow down to just one. And we can reverse our idea. Instead of reduce graffiti, we can reverse that to encourage graffiti. Maybe there are some authorities, there probably are, some that are looking to encourage it in certain areas. So that Scamper model is just one way of taking your initial idea and just maybe tweaking it in ways that might make it more original, more interesting, more relevant, possibly more topical. And it gives you more options as a storyteller. So this is going to take a bit more time, but again, just pause the video and apply that Scamper process to your chosen idea. And in particular, I just want to focus on 4 of the most useful techniques of those 7. So substituting something, modifying something, so changing the time scale, changing the geographical scope of the story, eliminating elements, and reversing. So just focus on those 4, take 15 minutes, come up with at least 4 new ideas now based on that, hopefully more than 4, and then resume the video. Okay, now you've done that, again, it's worth just pausing and talking about how you can evidence that process in the assignment. All of these processes of generating ideas, developing ideas, editing, filtering, again, are really useful to record and include as evidence in your assignment. And the really vital part of this, the essential part of this, is that you need to be connecting what you're doing to your wider reading. So there should be some reason for the fact that you're using a particular technique. You've read about it, basically, or perhaps you've interviewed someone in the industry. You've done your own original research and found out about it. So again, make sure you reflect on this in your assignment, point to the evidence in an appendix, and talk about the literature that relates to this. So the link in the earlier slide, in this slide, is to an article by Smith. So that would be the reference. and you've got a reference to an appendix here as well. So that's all I want to talk about in this video. In a separate video, I'll talk about other aspects of idea generation. But the key points here are, first of all, really do not skimp on this stage of the storytelling process. What a lot of people do is they spend a couple of minutes at most coming up with ideas, take the first one that seems good enough, and then rush to the exciting bit of actually, finding an interviewee, making the story. But actually finding the interviewee, making the story will be much, much harder if you haven't spent a lot of time on coming up with good ideas and being really clear about why you're telling that story and who you're telling it for. So don't skimp on this stage of the storytelling process. Really spend a bit of time developing your ideas, improving them, adapting them, evaluating them, filtering them. And when you do that, reflect on how this mirrors professional practice, because ultimately that's what you're trying to get to. You're trying to move from being an amateur media producer who makes content for yourself, for your own pleasure, to a situation where you're able to generate lots of ideas on a regular basis and develop really good, strong ideas. Pitching ideas is one of the most important parts of the media production process. It's one of the most common things you'll be tested on in interviews and the job application process. So think about that professionalism. Think about what takes you up that level to being professional, serving an audience, following conventions, and by conventions here, we're also talking about conventions around idea generation and pitching. Some further reading and watching that you can do around this, that link to the Scamper creativity model is there. Nathan Bohr's 4 pillars of storytelling is really useful for referring to some of these ideas. And chapter 8 from Lee Gutkin's book, The Art of Creative Nonfiction, is a good example of an explanation of professional practice when it comes to generating story ideas.